people jump on later, then they should jump on later. So hi, everybody. I am Lisa Rosenberg. I'm the Executive Director of Open the Government. Thank you to the panelists and to the audience, for lack of a better word, for joining this Sunshine Week Open Government State of the Union. Especially given everything else that's going on, we really appreciate your attention and your time to these matters. I want to quickly introduce our experts, who are all, their lovely faces are all on your computer screens right now, and then go over the format for today. So our experts are Liz Hempowicz. Liz, wave. She is with Project on Government Oversight. We have Alex Howard with the Demand Progress Education Fund, Irvin McCullough with the Government Accountability Project, Ryan Mulvey with Americans for Prosperity Foundation, and Melissa Wasser with Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. And all are experts on a range of openness and accountability issues. So whatever questions anybody has, please don't be shy. Somebody's going to know the answer here. But rather than treat this like a traditional panel, opening statements, that sort of thing, I thought it might be a little bit more interesting and more fun to make it more of a conversation. So I want everybody who is listening in, watching in, what's the right word? It's not audience, but in any case, for everybody who's online, to definitely feel free to jump in and ask questions, or text if you have questions, use the chat if you have questions that you want me to ask, whatever. But let's kind of keep it informal. I've already encouraged the panelists to ask questions of each other, talk to each other. We have an hour, and we can really cover a lot of what's going on in openness and accountability, and we should just keep it as interesting and relevant to everybody who is online as we can. Now, having said all that, I am going to take advantage of my moderator's spot and launch the conversation, start the conversation. And it seems like an obvious place to start is with the coronavirus. And there's a couple of accountability issues that I know I'm concerned about, and we at Open the Government are concerned about, that I kind of want to get some feedback and some input on. The first was that the White House announced, gosh, was it just last week, that Vice President Pence would be coordinating the messaging effort around coronavirus, around the pandemic. It seemed that experts, scientists, health officials in the government would have to basically clear their messages through the Vice President, through the White House. And that certainly struck most of us here probably as potentially chilling of free speech. There was concern that it would be limiting the accuracy and timeliness of the information that did get out, and it's information that we think we can all use. I think another, the White House's argument would probably be that they needed to coordinate the message. They wanted to speak with one voice. We needed to also not instill panic or fear. So I'd love to have a little conversation about what everybody thinks about that part of the coronavirus effort. And then the other part that I think is even more concerning is the Reuters report just yesterday that the White House is classifying a number of meetings around coronavirus, and as near as anyone can tell, and again, I would love to get everybody's feedback on this, there's no legal justification for that at all, and probably no even policy justification for that, other than, well, probably no policy justification for that at all. We'll just leave it at that. And so I'd love to get anybody's thoughts. Has that ever happened before? Is this unprecedented? It certainly seems unprecedented to me, and it seems like a dangerous precedent to begin to start. Now, for our part, I will say one thing that Open the Government is doing is that, along with the Government Accountability Project, we filed FOIAs just yesterday, the day before, to try to access some information about the response to the virus. We've submitted FOIAs to CDC and NIH, again, about this directive to message everything through the Vice President's office. And we want to get some other information about, the meetings and documents and who's talking to who. I don't expect we're going to get a lot of fast responses to those FOIAs, but we are prepared to do what we can to expedite the responses, go to court if necessary. So we'll certainly keep everyone posted as those efforts evolve. But with that, let's talk coronavirus. Maybe Irvin, I'll just point at you first, since since Gap was part of who helped us out with these FOIA requests. But obviously, anybody else should feel free to chime in at any time.
Absolutely. So I'll go through exactly why we see this directive as so chilling. And to refresh a bit, all of the science experts and all the science agencies working on the coronavirus outbreak response are being told by the Vice President's office they have to coordinate all of their messaging with the VPOTUS office, as opposed to just going out and making their own statements. And like you said, that usually could be a good idea. That speaking with one voice during a national crisis can very much be a good idea. But what we don't know is whether or not whistleblower rights are being constrained, or whether or not employees and scientists working for the government might perceive their whistleblowing rights to be constrained. For the past 2 decades or so, every year inside the Consolidated Appropriations Act and also inside the Whistleblower Protection Enhancement Act of 2012, there's a provision that says you have to include this paragraph in any management communication that's gagging employees, federal employees, or restricting their rights to free speech or free expression. And that paragraph essentially says that everything else in this management communication is null and void and unenforceable. It does not go past your whistleblowing rights, that no matter what communication that we give to you that restricts your ability to communicate openly, you still have whistleblowing rights. And what that means for a lot of CDC or HHS employees is that regardless of centralizing a message with the Vice President's office, if they see a substantial risk to public safety, they can still make any claim that they want to that supports that claim. What we don't know is whether or not the Vice President's directive actually had that paragraph in there, reminding employees that they are duty bound or at least free to speak out when they see something that's going on that's wrong with the coronavirus response.
Irvin, you mentioned that we just don't know whether or not that's happening, and I think that can be said about kind of a lot of what we've seen out of the White House in their response to coronavirus. That it appears to me that we're being asked to give them the benefit of the doubt that they have not earned. So those same statements.
Liz, I'm going to interrupt you and ask you to speak up a little bit.
Yeah, sure. I very rarely hear that. But just that statement that Irvin was talking about earlier, that's legally required to be in all these communications guidance documents, at the beginning of the Trump presidency, they weren't included. And so he's totally right that they might be inside these guidance documents, but the fact that we haven't seen them means that we just don't know. And I think it is asking for a bridge too far from the White House to ask us to trust them, basically, when for the last 3 years they've been, kind of just jumping over and jumping through legal and all these laws. And even when the law explicitly requires things, including from transparency or accountability, they're trying to find every way out of those environments.
Anybody else have any thoughts or responses to the directive about communications? Melissa, what about from sort of a reporter's perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, the biggest thing here is that when the Reuters article came out, we immediately had eyes on it because it's going to hurt the press's ability to report information to the public. I think something that's going on right now with how the government has responded, how they've had to coordinate their efforts of communication through the Vice President's office, is that people are getting conflicting information. They're not getting enough information. People are scared. They don't know where to turn. So it's up for, it's the responsibility of the press to make sure that they're reporting accurate information so the public is prepared and ready, should coronavirus or, this affect them at home. So if they're classifying things or treating, these meetings as classified, it's really going to hurt journalists' opportunity to report accurately and fairly on this. I mean, a tip that we're seeing is that even though what's happening at the federal level is, very concerning, journalists might be able to use FOIA resources at the state and local levels to see you know, what their localities and their states are really doing. You know, even right now, we're seeing that there's drive-by or drive-in testing in Denver. You know, in Colorado, it might be easier to submit a FOIA request to see what communications were there to go to that decision. In Ohio, my home state, you know, they've canceled all of these in-person sporting events, you know, NCAA first four tournaments. You know, you might be able to use state FOIA resources to kind of get more information and more accurately report this out to the public. So, you know, we're hoping that reporters are still, you know, taking precautions themselves. I would also like to point out that CPJ, the Committee to Protect Journalists, also recently released resources on how journalists can cover the outbreak. So those are also helpful as well. But there are state and local resources that they can use in addition to federal ones.
And what about, thank you. I think those are great tips. And it's certainly something that many of us who've done FOIAs have always, you know, realized is that if you can't get the information from the feds, you know, you try another avenue. And a lot of times, whatever the topic is, you might be better off going through the state or local resources. I want to dig in a little bit more too about the whole classification piece, though. In addition to not getting information out, you know, there's a concern that the right people, the knowledgeable people aren't in the rooms that decisions are being made because they don't have the proper security clearance. I think that could be, you know, really detrimental for the health and safety of the people in this country. But also, you know, if this information is classified, how hard is it going to be to ever find out, you know, even once this crisis is over, you know, what what decisions were made? And I don't know if anybody has any thoughts. Alex, I bet you do have thoughts on that.
Well, sure. I mean, this is the opposite of what we should be expecting from our federal government in a public health crisis. And unfortunately, we're seeing a lot of things happen at the same time right now that make this much worse than it should be, right? And I wish that weren't the case. I wish that we didn't have a president who's the greatest source of disinformation in our public life, right? I wish that we had a White House that had been holding press briefings. I wish we didn't have systematic delegitimization of the media that we are now trusting to get this right, as Melissa just described. I mean, it is so important that our national leaders, our civil servants, our scientists are able to get trustworthy information to people in the places that they are and cease attacking the journalists who are doing their best to get that information and also leverage the tremendous resources that have been built up now for many years to provide information directly to the public online in actionable ways. And unfortunately, the information environment, as everyone knows, has been incredibly polluted by misinformation and disinformation, and rumors are running rife. Social media and smartphones have changed the context. We're living in this right now by zooming in together and talking where there's a back channel. It is critical that the government does not keep secret that which the public needs to know because they're concerned. Every time there's a gap between what they know and what they tell us, it decreases trust even more. And it doesn't take a lengthy recitation of all the times in our country's history where that's been true. Whether it's Vietnam, right, or that's what happened in the Iraq War, anytime that the top level of government knows something that has an impact upon public health or public safety and mislead the public or conceal it from the public, then it gives even more gas, I think, to the rumors and misinformation. And given that this is a Sunshine Week open government discussion, it's never been more important to encourage every politician to emphasize the importance of trustworthy information and that journalists do not invent sources and they're not out to get people. They're part of our communities and they have families too, and they are trying to just do the best they can to hold power to account and to use those tools.
Well said, absolutely. Ryan, did you want to chime in there?
Yeah, I mean, I think I have two thoughts. I would agree with a lot of what Alex just said. I mean, regardless of whether there are adequate legal or policy grounds to, at least within the FOIA space, to classify and withhold information, the danger is always avoiding overclassification and unnecessary withholding, particularly when you're dealing with a topic of pressing national concern, where there's not only a lot of press interest, but ordinary citizens are looking to the federal government for information about what's happening and what they need to do. I think stepping back to maybe the first topic that we got to, and the sort of coordinated and centralized effort to control information going out to the public, that doesn't surprise me. Certainly, the current crisis of coronavirus is something that we haven't seen, if ever, in the history of the FOIA. I mean, this is a rather unique situation. But previously, the other administrations, including this administration, but Democratic administrations as well, have used sort of centralized, sensitive review processes when different agencies are getting requests on the same topic. And often that has been routed through Office of White House Counsel. I've seen records suggesting that in previous instances it's gone through Office of the Vice President, when the Vice President sort of acts in a special capacity, as Vice President Pence is doing. And I think for all the benefit that could bring, on paper at least, the danger is in slowing, in a most charitable sense, the danger is slowing down the release of information. But what also ends up happening is a politicization of FOIA and of disclosure. And for whatever reason, whether it's to avoid embarrassment, a political fallout, or because of maybe a bureaucrat thinks it's for the public benefit to keep something secret, which, as Alex has suggested, is often the opposite, and ends up having the opposite effect, you see a lot of information tied up and just never released or improperly redacted because of those sensitive review processes. So it's not unprecedented in a sense, and it doesn't surprise me, but it is something that we should be concerned about and vigilant, and hold the government their feet to the fire on this.
Yep.
Can I jump in and tie a few of these things together? So, I think what you were saying earlier, Alex, is totally right, that the context really matters here. And the White House has been really instrumental in kind of contributing to the problem we're having right now, where we're not quite sure what information we can trust coming from what sources. And so I want to go back to what Irvin was saying earlier too, is that's why it's so important that we can hear from career civil servants right now that are experts in these spaces and in these issues, because I think even given the damage to the civil service and the morale there are still a lot of people inside government that know what they're doing, that are not political actors, and that can speak with the voice of authority right now, that frankly is just lacking from some of the institutions that should have that authority, or should be able to speak with that authoritative voice. But even that politicization process has affected FOIA, and we've seen agencies this year moving towards an increased role of political appointees in the FOIA review process, and a decreased role of civil servants in reviewing those records and in determining what is responsive to the request and what isn't. And so I think, this problem isn't limited to this White House, isn't limited to this administration, but given the situation that we find ourselves in right now, the coronavirus and the severe threat it poses to public health, I think we've reached a catalyst where all these issues are coming together, and we're starting to see the importance of everything that's happened over the last few years.
I want to jump in too quickly to respond to something Ryan said. So this hasn't happened before in the same way. I was around in 2009 when H1N1 hit, and I watched what happened with Ebola in 2014. And there is a marked contrast between how this administration and the last one approached messaging to the public, how they elevated experts, how they coordinated pandemic response in the White House National Security Council, which we know was diminished in 2018 because the president decided it wasn't important. Like there is a contrast. And the contrast couldn't be clearer around the elevation of government scientists and government expertise, as opposed to the consistent denigration of that expertise and undermining of their authority, even contradiction. And to Liz's point, we saw again Dr. Fauci in front of Congress, who is clear, who is doing exactly what we hope someone in his position would do, and acknowledging, for instance, that there is a failure of testing, right? We have the president going on camera to addressing the nation last night, claiming that testing is fine, and it's clearly not, right? This is something that the world can see, that we are way behind where we should be. We have Congress performing its role, having public hearings where the public can see, can go on C-SPAN and watch the hearings. And this technique of trying to gaslight us all into believing we're not seeing what we're seeing isn't going to work on this. And it couldn't be more important for, I think, this community to be rallying around exactly what Liz is saying, right? To elevate the scientists and ensure that the whistleblowers, which I hope Irvin will come back to, are upheld, right? That their immune system for making sure that there isn't fraud, waste, abuse, incompetence, corruption being hidden. Well, now they're really important for making sure that government response is going well too.
I totally agree with that. And I will get back to the whistleblowers in just a minute. Before that, I agree with all the points that the folks on the panel just raised. I want to go back to the overclassification issue really quick, just to say that, back to Liz's point earlier, this is where any administration has to draw upon a reservoir of trust that they've created through years of actually being open and honest. And the Trump administration just does not have that. As Reuters reported, administration officials said that they weren't being given access to certain meetings or certain documents or certain records because those records or meetings are classified or are happening inside a SCIF. Now, I can play devil's advocate for that. I can see why some, every once in a while, meetings on the coronavirus might have to happen in a SCIF. My first thought when I read the Reuters article was of a piece by a journalist named Jenna McLaughlin in Yahoo News at the end of February, where she reported that most of the intelligence that we had or data that we had available on the China outbreak was collected by the Central Intelligence Agency. And that means that when you have a fair amount of data that's being collected by the intelligence agencies, it probably will be classified, and there might be a valid reason for that to happen. But in this case, the Trump administration does not have a reservoir of trust to draw upon and say, hey, listen, some of this is validly classified, some of it is justifiably classified. When we're on the outside looking in on the verge of a pandemic, in the midst of a pandemic, that's not good enough. They actually have to explain exactly why this is happening. And to my recollection, I don't even think they've responded to the Reuters piece yet. I could be wrong there, but I haven't seen any public response justifying the classification or saying that these meetings are all being hosted in unclassified settings. And on the whistleblower point, I really am afraid that this will discourage whistleblowers from coming forward. There are different systems when classified information is involved for reporting that information either through the administration internally or to Congress externally. One victory that our community secured recently was the ability for non-intelligence community employees to make reports of classified information. So make whistleblowing disclosures involving classified information, not just to the congressional intelligence committees, but to any committee of relevant jurisdiction. And that's really important. It's something that we would not have expected to be utilized in this instance. When I thought of it, when a lot of us were thinking of it and toying around with the language, what we were thinking and had in mind was State Department employees wanting to go to the House Foreign Affairs Committee. But I could very realistically see a situation in which HHS or CDC employees want to go to the House Energy and Commerce Committee with classified information for oversight and investigations into whatever wrongdoing they may see. But at the same time, you have the administration actively trying to chill these whistleblowers, rejecting the science. And that's dangerous to everyone because it means not only do they not really have a response put together, but whistleblowers who would be the eyes and the ears on the ground implementing this response, overseeing its implementation, making sure that no problems are there, they're chilled. They might not come forward just when we need them to come forward the most.
And I think one of the...
Go ahead, Liz.
Well, I think, Irvin mentioned that really great provision allowing whistleblowers with classified information from outside the intelligence agencies to be able to go to the committees of jurisdiction. But I think contextually, again, it's important to think about the moment that we're in right now, especially on the heels of an impeachment effort. Everything Congress does is seen as political. And I think this is another place where it's really important for us to take partisan politics out of this and look at this as the health crisis that it is. And so if there are whistleblowers going to Congress to blow the whistle on what they're seeing in terms of the government's response to coronavirus, they should not be politicized the same way that we've seen previous whistleblowers politicized. And it's really important, you know, I was seeing Republican senators earlier today kind of speaking out and saying, you know, we should be correcting the message, we should be making sure that we're getting the right information out there, and that, you know, correcting what the president has said, that people aren't able to get tests if they want to, and the importance of making sure that accurate information is out there. And I think we need to make sure that we can make that as easy as possible, especially for members of Congress, that this isn't a political statement to be telling the truth right now. You know, there's a real reason, and it's, you know, lives are at stake here.
I mean, I think you're right. I don't know if I'm optimistic that a whistleblower coming forward with any information right now would not be politicized. But you know, I agree that this community has to encourage that at least, and support whistleblowers and support those few members of Congress, and hopefully increase the numbers of members of Congress, you know, who are willing to support the truth. I mean, it's amazing to me, and on Sunshine Week, you know, Sunshine Week is supposed to be a celebration of openness, transparency, accountability, and the partisanship that has, you know, kind of infused the issues of transparency and open government is remarkable to me. I mean, it's really, these are such sort of basic issues, you know, motherhood and apple pie, but they have all become very politicized. And I just, it's something that I think going forward, you know, we're going to have to try to address. It's going to, again, be up to this community to say, look, these are not partisan issues. These are not political issues. These are foundational issues that are important to our democracy. And I wanted, if we have time later, to get into that a little bit more sort of forward looking. But we did have somebody from the audience who raised a question on the group chat that I do want to pose to anybody who wants to answer. And I think it's related in terms of kind of the efforts we see of this administration to kind of control information. There was an event that I was not at earlier at the Department of Justice, where the Deputy Associate Attorney General was quoted as saying, and I'm just reading this here, an increase in nearly immediate litigation brought by some savvy frequent FOIA requesters strains our FOIA officials in their valiant efforts to respond to every request in a timely way. Litigation on the part of the well-funded pushes ordinary citizens to the end of the queue. Now that sounds like motherhood and apple pie. It sounds like everyone should have equal access to FOIA. But again, given, I think, all of our skepticism about how much we can trust this administration, you know, what do people think of that? Are we actually being told, and maybe Melissa especially can weigh in, not to litigate our FOIA requests, not to make FOIA requests? I mean, what is that message telling those of us in this community right now, and the public? I mean, what's the message that's being sent there?
Yeah, I mean, I can definitely start weighing in. And in my role, I don't do any litigation. You know, the Reporters Committee gives pro bono legal representation to journalists, and some of what we do is FOIA litigation. And it's usually when they have gone beyond, I will say well beyond the statutory deadlines to respond, give any information, or we receive a GLOMAR request where they can't confirm or deny. Again, while this is the Principal Deputy Associate Attorney General, I understand that, you know, there's people litigating and that could clog up the system. However, you know, we're trying to receive information. We're not receiving the information about what our government is doing. And so if it's not as if we file the FOIA request the next day we're in litigation. You know, we're weighing all of our options, and I'll defer to others on the panel who have been in some more significant litigation than I personally have. But you know, we agree that there's an access issue, but there's an access issue for everyone. And so I'd defer to others on the panel.
Sure, and I mean, I think Ryan probably has experience with this. I mean, I think one obvious thing, again, for those of us in our community, that we can do looking forward is advocating for more resources for FOIA offices and FOIA officers so that they can respond and they don't have this excuse of, clogging up the pipelines. But Ryan, what are your thoughts on?
Yeah, well, so I've worked with a lot of FOIA professionals within the government through ASAP and at government trainings where I've been invited to speak. And I think for most line FOIA officers, they also have a passion for FOIA and they like to try to get information out. And I think sometimes they're demonized, and that's not good. It's always better to have a good working relationship. But for every good low-level FOIA professional, there is a policy person or a political appointee above them who's making life for that lower FOIA professional difficult. I think backlogs and the need to file a lawsuit to actually get your response to your FOIA request isn't new, but I think it is true that in this administration, like we've seen it taken to a new level. I'm litigating a case right now on Section 232, the automobile tariffs report. If you hadn't heard, this report that was at issue was not published as is required by law, and Congress passed a rider in one of the appropriations bills this last end of the year, requiring publication, and the government refused to do that, published an OLC opinion saying why they didn't have to do it. We now have a bipartisan group of senators who've appeared as amici in our district DDC case, arguing how crazy the administration is. And I mean, I've had in open court in a second hearing that was held in this case, opposing counsel basically say that you are meaning me, my organization, you are weaponizing the FOIA. The president has deigned to give you as much information as is necessary for you to know in a presidential proclamation last year. And you just have to trust him that has the national security in mind. I kid you not, these were the actual arguments that were offered. And I think that you've seen similar arguments elsewhere. I mean, it seems like every other day in the Hill or Politico, we hear about a DDC judge who's throwing out declarations for an agency or grilling government counsel for really making outlandish arguments in under FOIA. And it's amazing that it's kind of come to that. So I do think that there's been a worsening in that respect. And it's not fair to blame the requesting community for the problems that OIP and the rest of the agencies are suffering. I mean, too many of the higher up officials are not taking FOIA seriously.
So we have a question from the audience. And also, if anybody just wants to ask a question, unmute yourself and you can ask these questions. You don't have to use the group chat, but I'm happy to moderate. But would it be better if FOIA offices were moved within agency IG offices? That might protect FOIA processes from political appointees. Does anybody want to weigh in on that, or other ways to protect FOIA from being politicized? Liz?
Yeah, I'll just start with two small points, and then I'd love to hear my co-panelist thoughts on this as well. But I think my first point is that it's not that there's no role at all for political appointees in the FOIA process. FOIA is about government processes, and government is made up of career civil servants and political appointees. And so I don't know if we want to, in my mind, it would be better to cut them out entirely if they can't behave responsibly and in the bounds of the law. But I don't think we're there yet. And then the second point is on inspectors general offices. Whoever asked that question, I love talking about IG, so thank you. But I also don't know if inspectors general would want that responsibility, because it would put them more, it would give them, I think it might create some tensions or stress current tensions already between the IG offices and the agencies. And IGs are supposed to work with agencies, they work within agencies, but they also report to Congress. And so there is already a bit of a natural tension between IGs and an agency, kind of the main agency staff. And so before we get there, I would see that as a more extreme move. And so before we get there, I'd like to try some interim steps.
Yeah, if I could just jump and respond to both of those points, I think they're both good points. With respect to the first, it seems to me we have to also think about the different types of political appointees that are involved in FOIA at agencies. So in the Office of General Counsel, the General Counsel is in many agencies going to be a political appointee. And there you kind of, well, and the agency head is a political appointee and may properly or improperly perhaps be involved in FOIA. It's when you have, I think in my experience, what I've seen that's most problematic is comms people, pure policy folks who aren't in a sort of leadership position, or when you have the White House involved either through a White House liaison or the Office of White House Counsel consulting with agencies. That sort of political involvement is what's most problematic. On the IG front, I think you also have a problem of, because many IGs are technically separate agencies, record sharing back and forth, it would be legally problematic to just move FOIA for an agency into the associated IG. Plus you have some agencies that don't have an IG. One interesting idea that my colleagues and I have spoken about is perhaps moving administrative appeal processes out of agencies, either into a new agency or a special FOIA court maybe, or somehow providing some independence to an appeals authority within an agency. I mean, you have some agencies that are, I'll never forget, I filed a FOIA request, I think it was with ACUS, and the FOIA officer came back and said denied, and I said, well, I appeal, and she said, well, don't bother, I'm the appeals authority too. So, you know, that's a slightly different problem than what I think the audience member asked, but you know, that's where we, I think, could make some movement instead of just moving FOIA altogether to the IG.
Alex, you look like you want to come in?
Yeah, sorry. I'm twitching because the IG's being empty, right? I mean, that this is a problem. POGO, where Liz, works, has done a great job tracking the vacancies, and Oversight.gov now has that. And you can see there are some agencies that haven't had them for over 1,000 days, right? Which is crazy. The bigger problem that I think is not so much where they are located, but this question that was brought up in the frame of the state of open government, right? That there's been a chilling effect upon agencies disclosing information that would contradict the assertions of the political leadership, right? And I think that's actually where the interference is most problematic, where there's a difference, again, between what officials are saying, whether it's the appointees or the White House, and what's actually happening within the agencies. And then FOIA has revealed that. I think it's perhaps more effective than it has been in my decade in DC in the last 3 years in showing what's actually happening, being discussed, and what's being portrayed to be happening. And like that is the kind of the state of things, is that there's been a thumb put down whereby people are, I think, pretty clearly incented not to speak out and not to disclose things if it would contradict the official line. From my perspective, instead of moving around FOIA, I would like to see the Department of Justice actually take its role differently. Instead of just being a compliance exercise and offering guidance, they should actually enforce something that exists within the statute that they have never applied. People don't realize that I think in the 70s, 73, 74, FOIA was amended and includes a provision that allows the sanction of individual employees if they're fined, if a court finds that their withholding was arbitrary or capricious. It gets referred, it gets investigated, there's a determination. It's never been used in the history of the country. Now, it's very infrequent at the state and local level too, that you see sanction for someone withholding records. But I think it's very clear right now that the incentive is to withhold. And despite there being a presumption of openness in the FOIA, which the people on this call fought for in 2016 to be in the statute, I don't think that the DOJ's stance here gives anyone in government any sense that if they withhold, they'll face sanction. Instead, the stance is that if you disclose something which shows the administration to have been, let's say, lying, for instance, then we'll crack down. And that's not where we want to be in a state of open government.
But the problem there also isn't just OIP or DOJ and OSC, which is responsible for investigating the referrals. A big part of the problem too is the courts, because the courts are responsible in the first instance for saying that there needs to be a referral. And we're beginning to see some things change, and it's amazing what's happening now in district courts in terms of discovery and cracking down and throwing out crummy affidavits and stuff. But I think for too long, even though there's a standard of de novo review, you've had district courts that defer exceedingly to the government when there are really weak affidavits proffered, and they give the government the benefit of the doubt and allow too many of these shoddy declarations to go through, and they don't really dig in where there's a possible instance of wrongdoing or intentional improper withholding by the government.
I want to jump in and say one thing about IG's access to government records. Sorry, going back to something, Ryan, you said a little while ago. IGs already have full access to the records of the agencies that they are responsible for conducting oversight over. And I think it's important to mention that because that was clear in the law already, but a few years ago, Congress had to re-clarify that when they said all records, they really meant all records, because the Office of Legal Counsel at the Department of Justice, which we've already touched on a little bit, came out with a legal opinion saying that actually you don't have to share all records with the Inspector General, and it's really important that IGs have access to every record that the agency has because of their role, not just conducting internal oversight of the agency, but they also serve as an external connector of information from the Congress, for the Congress. And so I did just want to correct that because it is really important, and it is something that Congress had to really fight for.
Thanks, Liz. We have about 15, 20 minutes left. Does anybody in the audience have any questions? I have many more if no one does, but want to keep it open. Doesn't look like anybody's unmuting or typing. I feel like there's one broad theme that's kind of gone through this conversation today is much of what we count on from our government when they're giving us information, whether we ask for it through FOIA, whether it's through, press appearances or whatever, is trust. There is an element of trust that we as the public and we as advocates and we as experts demand or need from our government. And I think it's fair to say that that trust has been badly diminished in the past 3 years. So I have two questions. I have one, is there any bright spot that anyone can point to sort of in the past year or so, or, the past 3 years in terms of openness, and that we can maybe feel a little hopeful and maybe trust some part of our government right now? And then the second, and I think more important really for me, is what do we do as advocates? Again, what do we ask for? What do we demand of our government to begin to restore that trust that has been so badly shaken? And I will open it up to all of you. But I know Alex wants to start, I can tell.
Well, I think it might be useful to say that public trust in government was already at historic lows before this administration. And that was something that, I referred to earlier. Every time there's been a difference between what the public believed was happening and what actually is happening, it's had an impact on trust. And that goes back to where there were historic highs of trust in the 20th century after World War II, right? And you can tick them off from Vietnam to Watergate to the Iraq War to the financial crisis. Like every single time you've seen public trust trend downwards afterwards. And it's not an accident that transparency laws have come in afterwards, right? And ethics reforms that have continued to enforce disclosure, to enforce public meetings, to enforce ethics laws, right? And to continue to show us how our government is actually performing or not performing. I mean, for me, the bright spot of the last 3 years is that our press is still doing a good job, despite the environment, despite the financial pressures, despite low trust in the press itself. We are still seeing the public be informed about what the government is doing, despite considerable efforts to keep things secret, which are obviously corrupt, right? Up to including the president taking abuse of power to, that's going to be the subject of impeachment, et cetera. The second is the openness of Congress itself. There's something that we see, I think, as a country when we see the votes, we see the hearings, we see the data that's coming out of there. Like, that is still a robust process. The courts can and should be more open, right? Maybe we can get to PACER and the problems of people having to pay for the raw materials of democracy. That's not okay. But the fact is that we are still being informed. The problem is that we're being informed about our government's incompetence or venality or corruption or lies, which in turn doesn't really bring us back to feeling comfort. And until officials uphold their responsibilities in full light, and show, don't tell, bring the evidence, I don't think that's going to change. Now, I have hopes that we'll see, our government turn around, because there's so much capacity at the federal level along with the state and local level, that public faith in our doctors and our scientists and our first responders and to all the extraordinary civil servants, public servants, professionals around the country will bring us back from the brink, I think, of panic, which is where feels like our tension is today. But unless we see that iterative building of trust to come back, it's going to get worse, not better.
Who else? Melissa?
Yeah, no, I'd love to jump in on the PACER point too, because I know, in the time that I've been in the Reporters Committee, we're trying to expand in certain areas, right? So something that we recently launched was our local legal initiative, which was a process with us looking at different states and realizing there's a lot of news, again, at the state and local level that don't have the resources to litigate, a FOIA request, or they're having trouble getting access to local law enforcement records. And so we are having an expansion into 5 different states. And hopefully we can help kind of bridge that gap. So that's, for us, that's kind of a shining light, right now. I would say when we expand in certain areas like court access, we've been working on a couple different things. Recently, we've partnered with Fix the Court to bring live audio of the Second Circuit and Fourth Circuit cases involving President Trump's tax returns. And I checked before we came online, and the NBC News video has almost 250,000 views. That's 250,000 people in this country that could not have traveled to New York to hear the Second Circuit. And we've tried in the past to also increase audio at the Supreme Court. We led a media coalition last year to try and get the Supreme Court to live stream the Title VII LGBTQ employment discrimination cases, along with the DACA cases. That request was unfortunately immediately declined, and there was audio at the end of the week. So on that front, and as we were talking about the impacts of coronavirus and the access to information, right now in Washington, to get into a Supreme Court case, for example, you have to wait in line, you get inside to maybe see the justices and see what's going on. With Congress closing and us not being in the Senate right now and having to switch to virtual modes, we've been monitoring a bill called the 21st Century Courts Act. And so that's HR 6017. It's with Rep. Hank Johnson, Mike Quigley, and Jerry Nadler. And it would increase broadcast access to the Supreme Court and to other federal appellate courts. Right now, every federal appellate court has some form of either live streaming or same-day audio that they get up, right after that argument ends. The Supreme Court is drastically behind. This bill, as Alex also mentioned, would give people free access to PACER, which is the online court management system that you would be able to see a court's docket. When we have reporters, in the field reporting on different court complaints, or an appellate court reached a decision, sometimes if the information isn't directly linked in the story and you don't have a PACER login, people can't really see or understand the fullness of what's going on. And so this bill would, among other things, increase broadcast access to the Supreme Court and federal appellate courts. It would give free access to PACER. It would allow online access for judicial financial disclosures, which I know other groups have worked on as well, and force the court to be more transparent and open on whether they're going to recuse. I know in the news, I think just this week, Justice Sotomayor recused herself due to a friendship with a potential petitioner or respondent. And, you know, we didn't really see a full explanation until people were asking. And so this would, you know, make it automatic. So I think in the future, I mean, we should be advocating for these bills that create more transparency and openness at all three branches of the federal government.
I don't think you'll get any objection there. I think it's really interesting that, you know, especially now, many of us have been looking to the courts to kind of restore balance of power, checks and balances. Many of us see, you know, Congress kind of abdicating its responsibility in that front. And so we look to the courts to step in. And yet at the same time, as Melissa clearly points out, you know, the courts are way behind in a lot of transparency arenas and fields. So it's definitely something forward-looking that I think that we should all kind of pay attention to. Who else wants to chime in on how we restore trust? Liz, your microphone's off. Is that because you're going to talk?
Yeah, so I did want to just make another point about courts and transparency there. Most employees of the federal judiciary also don't have whistleblower protections. And so kind of the internal workings of the judiciary are also not subject to the kind of oversight and scrutiny that I think they should be. But to your earlier question of what are some of the bright spots during Sunshine Week, I would just highlight two kind of general ones. I mean, on the topic of FOIA, we have seen FOIA work also during this administration and previous administrations, but I wanted to highlight specifically the role that FOIA played in getting information out that was relevant to impeachment. While the executive branch was stonewalling Congress's access to information, they were actually responding with responsive documents to those subpoenas that Congress had served the executive branch with. They were actually releasing a lot of the documents that would be responsive to those to outside organizations that had FOIA'd for them. American Oversight did a really great job of posting that information as soon as they got it and really pushing the executive branch to release it. And so we have seen some really exciting successes there. And then the second would also be that there still are whistleblowers coming forward, even while we have so much has happened over the last few years, and especially the last 6 months, that would, I think, reasonably deter whistleblowers from coming forward. But we're still seeing people do that and come forward and raise concerns about not just coronavirus, but other issues going on within the federal government. And that to me is telling. And so I wanted to also just flag that up on our website. We have a lot of resources for any would-be federal whistleblowers or even just federal employees or contractors who are worried about what are their rights and want to inform themselves. And we put a lot of those resources together in consultation with Government Accountability Project and PEER and some of our partner organizations in that advocacy work.
Thanks. Anybody else? Irvin?
Yes, please. I completely agree with you, Liz. I think one of the biggest successes that we've actually seen in the past few years is how many whistleblowers are willing to speak truth to power, even when it is very, very, very difficult. It's funny that the theme that has been permeating throughout this discussion that, Lisa, you identified is trust. And that's because I think we're at almost an all-time low of the amount of trust that the average citizen can have in their federal government right now. Back when I was in school, I wrote my thesis on breakdowns in the U.S. accountability sphere. So where IGs and the Office of Special Counsel and the Mayor Systems Protection Board, what happens when those things falter? And one of the words I used more frequently than any others in a word cloud on that thesis was the word trust. And the IG system, the OSC, the Mayor Systems Protection Board, this accountability sphere was created because of a fundamental lack of trust in the 70s between the people and the executive branch. It took a while for people to actually be able to trust the IG system, the Office of Special Counsel, and the MSPB. And in a lot of ways, those systems can still fail and they can still be inadequate. But I'm hoping that what we can do to recover from this lack of trust that we feel right now is by strengthening those systems as vigorously as we did in 1978, 1979, 1980. Reforming the systems as much as possible. Specifically for the Whistleblower Protection Act and the Civil Service Reform Act, 4 things that really need to happen are granting employees the right to a jury trial in federal court when they're retaliated against for making a protected whistleblowing disclosure. We should give whistleblowers the right to challenge retaliatory investigations. So when a whistleblower makes a protected disclosure and all of a sudden they're staring down the barrel of a time and attendance violation or some other type of investigation by their own agency, that's a very common retaliatory tactic. And as of now, there are very few tools whistleblowers can use to challenge that mode of retaliation. Another thing is extending temporary relief to whistleblowers whenever they prove a prima facie case of retaliation. Facts are essentially there. There should be some way for these whistleblowers to seek and enjoy temporary relief. Beyond that, we should be extending these whistleblowers' rights beyond protection from workplace retaliation. As we've seen in the past few months, retaliation is not limited to the four walls of one's office or one's agency building. It can extend into the public sphere. It can extend into the courts, where we've seen whistleblowers from government contractors facing heavy million-dollar slap suits. If we do all of these things, we can finally put a capstone on the Whistleblower Protection Act and the Civil Service Reform Act, while still recognizing that we may need to further reform in the future. But right now, I'm really hoping that we're setting the stage for a new type of civil service reform breakthrough, the same that Jimmy Carter was able to usher in when he was president, and that he actually campaigned on. I believe he was one of the very few presidents to actually mention the boring topic the most, but the fascinating topic to me, of civil service reform in his State of the Union address. I think that's what we really need, that kind of reform.
Ryan?
Yeah, well, I think in terms of hopeful areas where we're seeing good stuff happening, at least within the executive branch, the Office of Management and Budget recently announced in court, so I don't think they've put anything in the Federal Register yet or made it otherwise publicly known, that they are going to be updating the FOIA fee guidelines that apply across the government. These were promulgated in 1986 and they've never been updated. So by April 30th, there's going to be a notice of proposed revisions and an opportunity for public comment on bringing those 30-plus-year-old guidelines into conformity with the law as it stands. So that's both with respect to the statute, things like the definition of a news media requester, which is pretty important, or the fee limitations of the 2016 amendments added to the FOIA, but also some of the important circuit precedents. So the DC Circuit's decision in SAC, for example, on whether students are able to get preferential treatment under the FOIA for fees. So we've seen that as we see that as a hopeful development, a good sign, although one that should have happened a long time ago. But we also see Congress interested in FOIA reform. There's been a pending bill in the Senate, 2220, Open and Responsive Government Act, and that's a bipartisan effort spearheaded by Senators Leahy and Grassley. And their Congress is really reacting to two things, trying to undo, in effect, the Supreme Court's decision in FMI v. Argus Leader from last summer. That was the Exemption 4 case that basically redefined confidential in a very broad way. And in the few cases at the district court level that we've seen come out since then, we've seen just how bad this new test was going to be, and how much of a negative effect it's going to have on the ability of people to get information from the government. So the Senate bill would reverse that Supreme Court decision and bring back the substantial harm test from national parks. And it would also codify the DC Circuit's decision in American Immigration Lawyers Association, which had to do with whether or not an agency can withhold information as non-responsive. Which was being used across the government for a good while, basically as an exemption, if you will, withholding information is non-responsive. So those both are positive developments. I think in terms of getting anything better out of the administration or government generally, it's going to take strong efforts by us within the community to expose instances where the government is falling short. I think we've had a good discussion about a lot of that with respect to whistleblowers. AFPF and Cause of Action Institute are releasing a report this week on agencies' compliance with the Federal Records Act with respect to the retention of instant messaging. And I think one of my colleagues, he's just shared a link to the report. We looked at, I think, roughly 40 agencies, and of those that responded, 13 of them admitted that they don't save these records, even though under NARA guidance, they should be saved, and they should be available under the FOIA. And it's pretty disheartening to see how many agencies are intentionally either deleting the records or changing settings on their computers so that the records are never saved in the first place. Unless we keep exposing that sort of willful failure to abide by NARA guidance or the FRA and the FOIA, and keep bringing it to our Congress men and women and other political decision makers, I mean, we're not going to see much movement, unfortunately. I'm a little pessimistic in that respect, but we have to keep doing our best to make sure attention is we put the spotlight on the wrongdoing, and hope for the best.
Thanks, Ryan. And I am looking forward to reading that report too. That sounds really important and really timely. And speaking of time, we are out of it, but I want to just end this conversation by actually being really pleased that we did come up with some bright spots. Our congressional champions like Senators Leahy and Grassley, the press, whistleblowers, and I think we are very fortunate that parts of the government are still working. There are parts of the government we still can trust. This is going to sound very Pollyanna of me, but my bright spot is certainly the advocates, everybody here on this panel, and so many others in the broader openness and accountability community. We haven't given up. We keep fighting the good fight. We will continue to fight the good fight, and we'll get there eventually. Slow progress, but we will keep fighting and we will keep winning. This was a terrific panel, especially given our constraints. So we're not live and in person on Capitol Hill. So thank you all very, very much. It seems like there's a few comments coming into the group chat. So take a look and respond if there's any questions over there. But otherwise, thank you all. Stay safe, wash your hands, and be well. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.